So I have the dubious pleasure of introducing myself. So I'll do it in the first person so as not to break the fourth wall. So my name is Wassim. I work at the Digital Currency Initiative at the MIT Media Lab. I've been in post for about 5 months, and I'm the managing editor of the new journal and conference series, Cryptoeconomic Systems, which hopefully you've heard a little bit about over the course of the day. And so thank you very much for coming and being part of this kind of extended experiment where we're kind of testing our ideas out, and we're trying to leverage the collective wisdom and knowledge of the crowd to try and understand a bit better how best to move forwards, how best to try and pull all these different fields together to bring and make connections between academia and industry, and try to also look at some of the pain points in scholarly publishing. Now, scholarly publishing is not a new thing, and so it's really some people think that parts of it are completely broken, and some people think that parts of it work pretty well. But there's one thing that's very clear is there's plenty of room to experiment and to innovate, especially with all the new technologies that we've got in this kind of post-digital internet age. So, but that's not what I'm actually going to talk about. I'm actually going to talk about some linguistics and semantic related stuff. So this is some work that I was developing in the 18 months prior to joining the DCI. Just make sure yes, that's working, great. So this is a project called TokenSpace, and it's kind of Angela's done a really great job of introducing and building up to this for me, where she talked about all the taxonomies and the ways of systematizing knowledge that people have been attempting to make in this space, and how they've all kind of fallen a bit flat over time. Now, I have a theory about that, and I'll get to it a little bit later. So yes, let's jump in. Don't have that much time. So yes, opinions are my own. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a regulator. If by mistake I say I think X is a security or X is a money, I did not mean it. So please bear that in mind. Okay, so what's the problem? The problem is that communication is hard, even at the best of times. So as humans, what do we do when I want to have a conversation with Angela? What do I do? There's some neural impulses. I don't know where they come from, we don't know that yet. And then that gets kind of down converted into small mouth noises. And then we've kind of collectively agreed that these small mouth noises have meanings and contexts and, places where we can use these, the norms of the societies and the systems that we live in, where it's acceptable to make certain kinds of small mouth noises and it's not acceptable to make other ones. And so you have this situation where if I want to have a conversation with anyone, there has to be a double translation taking place, where I make mouth noises, you hear mouth noises, your brain decodes those, and you try to figure out what I mean. So by that token, you must imagine how difficult it is for our brains to be at conferences where we hear people from, especially in interdisciplinary ones, where you hear people from different fields talking about different things in different ways, and you're trying to make sense of it all and cram it into your head and synthesize it somehow. So I really like this little meme I found on Twitter of a baklava wearing a balaclava while playing balalaika on a baklava. So sometimes words that sound similar don't mean the same things, and then sometimes words that are different mean the same thing. And obviously, context is not a myth, and we live in this intensely subjective realm. So that's kind of the background of where we are. And then let's jump into blockchain cryptocurrency land. And so the image on the left is kind of this very simple stack of layers representation of a cryptocurrency network, which Vitalik Buterin first developed in a Medium article called The Meaning of Decentralization a few years ago. And we added a couple of extra layers to that. And so to Angela's point, where she said, it's hard to define things like permissionlessness or decentralization or censorship resistance, I try to define them on a layer. So I like to say permissionlessness is primarily a social layer phenomenon, where certain subsets of users of the protocol are not prevented from using the system. Censorship resistance might be more like a protocol layer phenomenon or a situation where the protocol does not prevent certain types of transactions from entering the record. And on the right is where you can extend this kind of stack of layers to like reducto ad absurdum, the ontological metastack, I like to call it, which I know that Michael Zargham would prefer was a spiral or some sort of open thing, but hey, we're talking about blockchains here, so stacks. Okay, so if any of you didn't see Gary's talk on the other side of the room before lunch, it was really recommended, and he gave testimony recently when the Senate was talking about, was it Senate or Congress, Angela? Senate? A Congress? I don't know. Yeah, I'm not even American. Okay, I don't know. Yeah, ask Gary. So he was there testifying, and there were people asking, do you think that Libra is a security? And then, come back a couple of years, and William Hinman was talking about this notion of Ethereum becoming sufficiently decentralized that, in 2014, 15, 16, the token sale of Ethereum looked like a security offering. But by now, the network has matured, lots of nodes running this thing, it's relatively permissionless and decentralized, and therefore it's no longer a security. So those kinds of situations raise way more questions than they solve. And like, if this thing was something and now it's not, when did it change? How did it change? Why did it change? And so we end up in the situation where we still don't really know where we stand with these things, at least in my opinion. So I've had to kind of really squish and abridge this talk to give it in a brief sense today. So I just want to introduce you to this thing that I've constructed called TokenSpace, which is kind of this non-binary classification framework. And you can think of it as a kind of three-dimensional idealized space. And each of these dimensions represents a specific, what you would call a meta-characteristic. And so on the picture here, you've got the S, which represents securityness. So if you think about Ethereum in 2014, it looked kind of like a security. And then in 2019, it looks less like a security. So if we take a non-binary approach to understanding that particular characteristic, you might say that it's come down in that particular axis. The M would be for moneyness. It's a bit more of a kind of self-explanatory concept. And the C is for commodityness. So I built this because I was a bit fed up of the lack of regulatory clarity of the situation in our world, and also that it seems like the easiest thing in the world to do just to say Bitcoin, Ethereum, and all the other cryptocurrencies. You just throw them all in a bucket and they're all kind of the same, right? They're just, whatever. So I took issue with this, and I wanted to find ways that we could try to tease apart the different characteristics of these things. Okay. So taxonomies are built from kind of characteristics from these building blocks. Now, tables are not that great in talks, so I will skip through them. But if you can imagine things like how well the stakeholders in a network are balanced, is the issuance proof of work or is it proof of stake? Was there an ICO? Was it given birth via a fork or an airdrop? And all these different characteristics as to where this thing came from, how it exists now, and its future trajectory can kind of be fed into a scoring system as to how you might relatively compare and contrast these different characteristics. So yeah, tables, talks, nah. But one of the things that I want to say is it's a way that we can squash and reduce the dimensions of all these details into something that's relatively easy to parse and comprehend. And that's a bit like what price does, right? When you look at a price chart, everything, all kinds of objective and subjective parameters and framings are going into that. And that's coming down into one number, which number goes up, number goes down, plot it on a chart. Anyone can understand that picture. And so we're just trying to attempt some kind of dimensional reduction here. But one of the kind of elephants in my room is that this is you're blending between objectivity and subjectivity. So this is kind of something that I don't think a lot of people like to admit when they're being subjective. So we're just bags of meat and water, we have thoughts and opinions, we're biased and we don't know it. And we like to think that the work we do is objective, but there may be some subjectivity in there. So what I like about the way that you can modularize a framework using something like TokenSpace is you can choose where you lie on this axis between subjectivity and objectivity. But if you want something really objective, you have to own the fact that it's going to be subject to what might be called Goodhart's law. The idea that if you set out a parameter which becomes a kind of a target, then people will optimize for that and it will be gamed. And this has happened countless times, and it's something that it seems like it's largely unavoidable. Imagine that I was a regulator. I'm not, but imagine I was, and I said that 10,000 nodes means that your cryptocurrency is decentralized. So then I would go to AWS and I would ask them for 10,000 nodes, and then, hey presto, I'm decentralized, I don't go to jail. So that's not a meaningful metric. We can't really use these easily gamed, Goodhart susceptible metrics. But on the other side, if you go too far into the domain of subjectivity, well, it's just your opinion. isn't it? I mean, like everything is subjective and we're all biased, and then things can't be, things are more difficult to reproduce, can't falsify, and yeah, we're back in the swamp again. So, yes, so is the problem computers or is the problem humans using computers? I think that there's underneath the veil of objectivity, there's usually some subjectivity. And so, yeah, I'll skip tables, pictures. Okay, so imagine this is a token space with the axes that I mentioned earlier. And then this could be some kind of regulatory boundary function through the space. And so then you can imagine, my pointer isn't working, but imagine a little spot right at the top. And that could be little baby Ethereum in 2014, looking kind of security-like after the token sale. And then as the number of nodes proliferates and the network acquires functionality and so on, it would come down this space. Now, to have a particular like red line in the sand seems a bit extreme. I could imagine more like a kind of traffic light system where you might have a green zone where things look like they might be fine, a yellow zone where things might not be fine, and then a red zone where things really do not look fine. So let's look at a token space. Here's one I made earlier. This is with the top 10 assets by the admittedly terrible metric of market cap as of about 6 months ago. And so what's interesting about this is that you see some of them are kind of out on their own. So people often say that Bitcoin is kind of its own animal, and that's, maybe you're seeing my biases here, but I kind of also see that too. I also think that Ethereum in time has also become its own creature. You see them, the others tend to cluster up, the proof of work networks that are derived from Bitcoin, the federated networks like Stellar and Ripple, and then the class of 2017, which I won't talk about very much. So, for obvious reasons. So if you have this kind of data, then you can start to do something like statistical computing. You can do cluster analysis, and you can try to find different populations by doing, this is k-means clustering, for example. It's of limited meaningfulness with 10 points, but I just wanted to illustrate that it's possible. You could do hierarchical clustering, and you can even plot these things over time. So if you think about how these networks, they're dynamic organisms, so they're changing over time. And so Bitcoin is becoming a better money and a probably better commodity, maybe less of a security over time. Ethereum's definitely become less of a security over time if you listen to SEC comments. Perhaps a better money too. I don't think Ripple's done very much, but yeah. Gold has probably become less of a good money as it's become less accepted and less linked to the monetary system. And the USD, I don't really know what's going on with that. Anyway, so I don't know if anybody saw this late breaking news about the Crypto Rating Council last week. And I was there thinking, hey, that's kind of like my thing. But yes, I haven't seen exactly how the sausage is made here yet. And I don't think they've even published the full set of rankings because, as I understand, this is a ranking system of 1 to 5 between like 1 is not a security and 5 is definitely a security. And they've just shown you the 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s, which is interesting. So apparently they do have some 5s, but they haven't said what they are. So maybe they're even less brave than I am in that respect. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much for your time.